So welcome everyone to the Jeju Forum 2021 panel on mitigating existential catastrophic risks, addressing the nexus between pandemics, nuclear dangers, and climate change. Organized for the Jeju Forum by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the APLN. My name is Shata Bisha Shetty, and I am the director of the APLN and previously was deputy director and co-founder of APLN's sister organization, the European Leadership Network. It is my great pleasure as moderator to be joined on this panel by three superb speakers. I will introduce them now in the order in which they will be making their opening remarks. First, we have Dr. Peter Hayes, who joins us from Lismore, Australia. Peter is the executive director for the Nautilus Institute in San Francisco. He's an honorary professor at the Center for International Security Studies at Sydney University and is APLN's very own research director. Peter has worked for many international organizations, including the UN Development Programme, Asian Development Bank, and Global Environmental Facility. He's a leading expert in tackling global security and sustainability problems in Northeast Asia. Second, we have Professor Vivian Lin joining us from Hong Kong. Professor Lin has over 30 years of experience in health policy, planning, and program development. She's currently the Executive Associate Dean of LKS Faculty of Medicine and Chair of Public Health at Hong Kong University. She was previously Professor of Public Health and Head of the School of Public Health at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And she was the Director of Health System for the Western Pacific region for the World Health Organization, where she led on the global priorities of universal health coverage and sustainable development goals. And last but not least, we have Tuya Naya-Mansour, who joins us from Ulaanbaatar. Tuya is an APLN board member and former foreign minister of Mongolia. She's worked on regional security issues in the Asia Pacific since the mid-1990s, both in and out of government. Her previous positions also include Director of Policy Planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Counselor at Mongolia's mission to the United Nations. She is currently affiliated with the School of International Relations and Public Administrations at the National University of Mongolia. So we have convened an exceptionally qualified group to tackle this session's topic on addressing the nexus between pandemics, nuclear dangers, and climate change. We are living at a time when the world faces multiple threats on multiple fronts. Nearly 3.5 million people have died from COVID-19 and over 166 million have been infected with the disease. We've seen governmental failures in adopting scientific advice, poor communication, and slow global and regional cooperation. Meanwhile, the risk of nuclear weapons continues to loom menacingly. As of 2021, there are over 13,000 nuclear weapons warheads in existence. And instead of planning for nuclear disarmament, nuclear armed states are increasing the role that these weapons play in their national defense strategies. Finally, the impacts of climate change are global and unprecedented in scale. These include shifting and extreme weather patterns, natural disasters, chronic drought, catastrophic flooding, and economic instability. Our current approach is simply insufficient to addressing these challenges. We must act now if the world is to stave off the worst effects. So our task in this panel, in the initial presentations, and then in the following interactive discussion, is to analyze the extent of the challenge, the consequences of inaction, and look at how we can do better. And with that, I will turn the floor to our first presenter, Dr. Peter Hayes.
Thank you very much, Shata, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join my co-panelists, Tuya and Vivian, and this is just an absolutely critical topic at this moment. One thing I think we have learned in the last year of the coronavirus pandemic is that it's forced humanity to confront three realities that hitherto have been largely suppressed politically. At least they've been subordinated and often pretty much neglected in policy agendas. And the first is that humans, simply put, are part of nature, and nature rules life. Nature sets the rules of how we live on this planet, not the other way around. we of course now use as a species so much energy that we actually change the planet at a global scale. We account for more than 50% of the geochemical flows of the way that the planet works, and we actually account for more than 50% of the live animals by weight. We now encroach upon habitats with reservoirs of nasty bugs that are deadly to humans, and by trespassing on their habitats, we create many crossover points and then offer them instant global transmission pathways. So the pandemic rules really has taught us that nature is in charge and sets the rules. The second learning in the last year and a half is that climate change impacts are now undeniable. I still remember the early climate work in the 1970s and 1980s around the world, but it's now upon us. And so too is the fact that humans determine the rate and the magnitude of this climate change. This is now well demonstrated scientific fact, and it's reinforced by the witnessing of the superstorms, the firestorms, the changes in oceanic circulation, the loss of ice caps, the droughts, the floods, the shifting disease vectors, the species extinction. We experience these losses directly and indirectly as humans via displacement, via economic losses, via ecological degradation, and perhaps psychologically, it also contributes to the kind of languishing effect that we've all experienced since we were required to lock down as a species under this pandemic. In the midst of these truly global systemic crises that threaten us as a species, and they really do threaten our long-term species existence, is the risk of nuclear war, which, as Shata Shetty just pointed out, remains urgent and all too realistic. Admittedly, the number of nuclear weapons has come down by a factor of 10 since the peak of the Cold War in the 20th century. But the number of nuclear weapons states has pretty much doubled since then, and with it, the number of international relationships based on nuclear threat. And that leads to an increase, an exponential increase, pardon me, of the number of ignition points that might lead to a nuclear war in the midst of these pandemic and climate emergencies. And each of these global problems, and some call them wicked or mega problems, have very different origins. They manifest in stress to humans and impacts on humanity with quite different characteristics. They have different rates of change, they have different scales, and they operate over different time horizons. But they actually affect each other and they can't be solved separately. Now, nuclear war can happen in a flash, in less than half an hour. Nuclear war, according to those who've experienced it and survived, actually stops time completely. It annihilates nature and it leaves survivors simply numb. Their trauma is actually multi-generational and possibly will continue for those who were nuked at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in '95 forever. A nuclear war would wreak enormous damage to our human institutions and our resilience and our ability to make decisions collectively. It would essentially disable our capacity to communicate, cooperate, and collaborate effectively to solve other global problems for many years. Now, pandemics like nuclear war also emerge with little warning and with enormous velocity. And because of our global reach, these pandemic attacks are now accelerating. We can expect more of them. This is not the first, and it certainly won't be the last of these kinds of pandemics. And by the time we recognize that it's happening, the biological agent is already spread, and we're left to play catch up, as we're observing in catastrophic ways today in India and other parts of the world. At the same time, the pre-pandemic flows of people's goods, services, energy, information have either halted entirely or decreased for some unknown time while we respatialize our relationships at many levels to try and stop the transmission. So pandemics actually slow time whilst we languish. And I just want to point out to everyone that this pandemic has already infected 4 out of 9 of the supreme nuclear commanders in Britain, the United States, France, and Pakistan with COVID, one of whom nearly died, and the other came out of hospital clearly out of his mind. So there is a relationship between pandemics and the risk of nuclear war. Meanwhile, global change in the climate envelops humanity as a whole. It is the envelope in which we live. And it's a much longer run affair than nuclear war or pandemics. Decades, centuries, or millennia are taken up as the time-lagged impacts in the system and the changes adjust based on the driving factors. And we, in turn, as humans, perceive and respond to these impacts over generational time. Thus, Indigenous Australians, for example, have stories about the last climate-induced ice age 10,000 years ago and how they retreated as the shoreline that was then extending out to the Great Barrier Reef was inundated by the seas that were advancing over land due to the ice melt at that time. Mostly, we anticipate that the climate impacts will be negative, harshly and massively so. And so our adaptation to them will frame our vulnerability to the pandemics. And these impacts also slowly and now rapidly in some parts of the world transform the very political, geopolitical tableau on which humans play their nuclear weapons games based on threat. Climate insecurities combined with pandemic-driven stresses on nuclear command and control probably likely increase the overall and daily cumulative risk that one or other nuclear commander will be the first to use nuclear weapons in war since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on that cheerful note, I'll stop and we can return to some of the issues about other existential threats and how we might actually come to grips with multiple simultaneous existential threats at the same time. Thank you, Shada.
Thanks, Peter. That was an excellent description of the nature of the problems we're facing, their different time horizons, and the very real relationship between pandemics and nuclear weapon risks. And we'll definitely pick up in the discussion later ways in which we can try and look to solutions and in addressing the interlinkages between these issues. And with that, I will turn to our next speaker, Professor Vivian Lin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. As a public health, I will drill down more on the pandemic aspects and some of the lessons, but let me also start with a discussion about the Nexus. There are some shared features that I think are actually quite important as we think about how we move forward and take some of the lessons. You know, I think when we think about kind of the community psychology, there is a sense that nuclear war, pandemics, climate change, they're all unexpected and dreaded events, but somebody else is going to look after it. And people don't worry about it on the day-to-day. Despite the fact that we have had warnings about all three, there's a certain sense, I think, in the community at large that these are all really distant, they're highly technical, and somebody's going to look after us. And of course, what we have seen with the pandemic is that, thank goodness, there are some really competent technical people in some places, but there have been many failings in terms of government decision-making and community polarization, just as there's been some successes as well, again, with social institutions and cooperation. I think with climate change, the world has now come to realize that this is not just a highly technical matter where you sort of debate the science, but it's actually looming, affecting everyone in quite a serious way. But I think the nuclear issue, it's still seen now as a somewhat distant issue. But I think if we think about the action that requires all three issues, ultimately depends on some level of popular understanding and a community constituency in order to move the agenda. The technical advocacy is important to guide the action, but it's insufficient. There's got to be that kind of a preparedness and a commitment to preparedness. And at the end of the day, we cannot get away from the need for solidarity, both within countries and across countries. So let me pick up those points in relation to the pandemic in a minute. But I think when we think about the nexus, the really critical points is, as Peter said, this is about human destiny. And we have to recognize that. Secondly, it's not just a government responsibility, but it's everyone working together. But what we have to do is address two kinds of tensions. One, which we saw with the pandemic, which is nationalism versus globalism. And the second one is one of, do we go with preparedness where we make some informed choices? Or do we go with a reactive short-term politics where there are winners and losers? And I think that's a point, these points really well illustrated by COVID. Now, if we look at the COVID situation, where countries have actually succeeded, there's been early action. Not always informed well by equity, but eventually a recognition that equity is actually at the center of it. There's been community engagement with mutual support, with leadership, with targeted messaging. There has been evidence-informed policy making, where science has been important. There has been learning from history, whether that's been Ebola or MERS or SARS. And at the end of the day, it's system thinking and system governance, not only within the health sector, but across all sectors and across levels of government, that has really led to those places taking the early action actually got better outcomes. And the countries, in this instance with universal health coverage, where you had a system in place, ready, you got better outcomes. So the flip side on the failings is insufficient community engagement, nationalism and politicization, giving credence to fake news, trading off health and the economy rather than understanding the interconnections, and separating the question of individual freedom from collective safety. It's the way we've dichotomized, and the consequence of inaction has been to higher rates of the disease, the higher death rates, the overwhelmed health facilities, overwhelmed health workers, and social and economic inequities. So how do we take this forward and into other issues, well, I think the global cooperation across the scientific elements and scientists speaking with a similar voice, it's not always uniform, but some level of coherence and looking for solutions has been really important. But at the level of the scientists and the technical people, it's also that sharing lessons. It's that rapid response and communication that go across borders that together has informed the world, both governments as well as communities. I think the second question is what some people have called the Asian exceptionalism. Now, if I think about COVID, certainly the history of SARS and MERS and remembering history has been important. And their history to be remembered, of course, in many places about nuclear war and about climate change impact already. The other issue I think that's been quite important in the Western Pacific country, and this has been studied, is that preparedness has meant a concern for a system that underpins security and a capability of management, and not just a simple checklist of, have we satisfied the international health regulations? That fundamentally, it's been underpinned by technical cooperation, people-to-people relationship, trust, mutual learning. And that's been quite fundamental to the capacity. And I think so building from that, we also see health is often a kind of a safe area for international collaboration. While we've seen the ideological debates, for instance, around climate change, stopping a lot of action in most areas of health, we see this as, who can argue against the importance of health? So in the Western Pacific region, we have a parliamentarians forum for global health. We have Pacific health ministers meeting. We have trilateral health ministers meeting between China, Korea, and Japan. And we also have regional groupings like ASEAN where many health issues get tackled. So I think these are some of the mechanisms for us to build on and look forward to. But at the end of the day, we must keep in mind the psychology and the culture of how communities relate. How do we raise the awareness, the understanding for action on global solidarity? Because when we're looking at humanity and the future of humanity, we all have to take matters collectively into our own hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for that very important contribution. You made it very clear that they are shared features between these problems, that they're distant and technical, but there's a need not just for governments to take responsibility, but responsibility should be cascaded down to broader communities. So we'll certainly pick that up again in the later discussion. I will now turn to our final speaker, Tuya Nyamasor. Tuya.
May I first extend my greetings to all participants in the Jeju Forum, and I'm glad to be part of yet another collaborative effort by the Forum and the APLN. When I was asked to talk about on mitigating existential catastrophic risks, addressing the nexus between pandemics, nuclear dangers, and the climate change, I spent some time thinking about what catastrophe would mean in the context of nuclear pandemic nexus. And I thought that the catastrophe in this context would mean the concurrent onset of a nuclear war and a pandemic, a global pandemic. So I hope I will never be there, but as stated in the report by the Research Center for Nuclear Weapons Abolition, the APLN and Nautilus Institutes, and I quote, "The distressing reality today is that the risk of nuclear war, intentional or accidental, is greater today than at any time since the end of World War II. And I hope we will never be there. The report states further that it's likely that the deadly infections will be a challenge for years to come, exacerbated by globalization, the increased mobility of populations, and crowded cities. So such a challenge, such a catastrophe would be happening in the context of another existential threat to humankind, which is climate change. And it's accelerating, and we need to have adequate resources and adequate political will to address this growing global threat. So animals fleeing warmer temperatures and relocating to cooler places, getting into contact with unknown environments, deforestation, desertification, and a host of other phenomena create ample opportunities for the spread of pathogens and future pandemics. Regarding future pandemics, I think the first order of business for governments, societies, and businesses should be improved preparedness across the board and educating the healthcare personnel, the populations at large, politicians and businesses on what a pandemic might involve, and putting in place crisis response strategies that address various contingencies and which are adequately funded is very important. Shata asked me to talk about the lessons from Mongolia regarding the pandemic. So I must say that despite the Mongolia's location between Russia and China, where in early 2020, they had quite a worrying situation with COVID-19. Mongolia was able to have quite a prolonged period of no infections period. And I think this was helped by the government closing borders early, air traffic, rail, roads, except for critical exports and imports, and roads as well. So we also saw quite stringent policies reinforced in terms of mask wearing and social distancing. But in November last year, we had the first community transmission of the virus. And in the first months, the government was quite successful in such efforts as testing and contact tracing. In fact, some 870,000 people per 1 million people were tested. So that was quite a good indicator of quite good efforts by the government. But in March this year, we saw quite a dramatic increase in the cases of COVID-19. And subsequently, hospitalization and treatment of the infected people became the first priority for the government and for the healthcare sector, along with the vaccination. As of today, they say that around 90% of the adult population and have got their first dose of vaccine, and some 40% of the population have got their second shot. But the question still remains, why with this rate of vaccination, we still see a continued rise in the cases? And some explain this by the younger people dropping their guard after their first doses. And we here in Mongolia have a population, quite a young population. And quite unfortunately, the majority of the cases registered lately are among the young people aged 22 to 34. While I must say that almost all of them recover eventually, and deaths occur predominantly among people aged age 16 older, but still in a country as young as Mongolia, this high number of infected young people is a sad situation. The other explanation I hear for why we have this many cases today is that the capital city, Ulaanbaatar, has gotten too crowded. In provinces, cases were numbered in single digits. But in Ulaanbaatar, for example, yesterday we had 500 cases, and it's mounting. So half of Mongolia's population, as you may know, 1.7 million people live in the capital city, and this has become a major social problem here in Mongolia. Overall, I should say that disbelief is the word that would describe my overall sentiment when I watched this most demonic pandemic, in the words of the report I just mentioned, creep its way across the globe. Moving to nuclear weapons, this existential threat to humankind of man's own making, there is also a sense of disbelief, because instead of coming together to overcome this deadly disease and make the world a safer place, the global great powers have instead rushed into conflict and confrontation. I'm tempted to say that they are doing this with gusto. Despite a couple of high-level meetings that were held recently, there are underlying competitive approaches in relation among those countries that do not bode well for the prospects of nuclear arms control, and let alone nuclear disarmament. If we look at the threats and challenges facing nations of deadly disease, climate change, social tension, income disparity, racial discord in some places, migration, and so on, we can see that these are all challenges that cannot be resolved with the resort to nuclear arms. And challenges are becoming increasingly non-traditional, such as using cyberspace, or using new technologies, and resorting to information warfare. But still, nuclear weapons are being modernized, and their nuclear doctrines remain intact, and deterrence remain the name of the game. One of the scenarios described in the RECNA APLN Nautilus Institute report, called Middle Powers Rising, discusses the role of middle powers, who would assume a more prominent role in responding to existential threats, such as pandemics. Some of the middle powers did respond very effectively to the pandemic crisis, but if we look at the vaccines used globally, they have been developed by those states that happen to be global powers. And I would argue that far from waning or ceding power to middle powers, great powers are reasserting themselves in the post-COVID world, and we'll probably see increased competition among them for power, resources, and influence. In this respect, the island mentality scenario mentioned in the report, whereby resurgent nationalism around the world leads to heightened tension and a sense of instability and a fear of war. This scenario may prove to be, in my view, a more realistic scenario. This scenario postulates that the continued rise of nationalism in the United States, China, and Russia, and the potential danger of autonomous weapons systems have made the risk of nuclear war far too dangerous. In these circumstances, what is important in a post-COVID world, in my view, is to try to salvage the existing institutions and strengthen them. Such institutions as the NPT and its review conferences, the United Nations and its bodies and other global institutions, instead of looking for ways to replace them with a new architecture or letting regional arrangements overtake their function, especially when it comes to the maintenance of international peace and security. The existing international institutions came into being in the wake of major upheavals, such as wars, and restructuring or replacing this current order will most probably involve more rivalry, more turmoil, more conflict, and possibly a war. No doubt the pandemic will lead to important transformations at various levels in the ways in which societies go about their business and live their lives, but it better proceed in an evolutionary way. In the meantime, the upcoming NPT review conference may turn out to be a litmus test of the ability of nations to persevere on the path of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. The conversation around nuclear disarmament has indeed become calcified, and the debates have indeed become stale, as noted in the report I have mentioned, overtaken as they are by fear and destruction caused by the pandemic. Hopefully, with the successful vaccination, the conference scheduled in later this summer will take place. The question to ask will be, will the parties to the NPT meet their obligations, or will we talking post-conference about a crisis in the nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament regime? Regarding Northeast Asia, it appears that the US administration is taking a more pragmatic approach to the issue of denuclearization. However, the region remains the focal point for scenarios of a major power rivalry turning into serious conflict. Let's not also forget Taiwan, the Taiwan issue. The intersection of rival interests by major powers and other regional actors constitute, I would say, the hallmark of the region in terms of geopolitics. It's not a very optimistic scenario I am describing here, but I think the pandemic has been a major wake-up call for all of us. A call to do away with complacency and a call to show stronger political will to achieve peace and stability on all leaders around the world, as well as on civil societies to come together to overcome the existential threats of nuclear weapons, pandemics, and climate change that we all have to resolve if we are to save the world and save the future generations from a catastrophe.
Thank you, Tuya, for that very sober and pragmatic assessment of the problem we're facing. I think one of the many important points that you made is that we, rather than reinventing the wheel, we should look to salvaging and strengthening the existing institutions that we have and mechanisms that we have to try and address some of these problems. So that's a kind of a good segue to our discussion, and a question that I would like to pose to all of you is, can some of the middle powers play a greater role in kind of filling the leadership gap, the void that we have in addressing these existential problems? looking at kind of pandemics and climate change and nuclear weapons, if the incentive isn't coming from the nuclear armed states, what more can other countries do to help fill that gap? So I'll turn to Peter in the first instance to go first. Peter.
Thanks, Shada. Well, when we look at we can call them the trinity of existential threats that we've been discussing this morning: climate change, the risk of nuclear war, and the current and future pandemics. Of these, the one problem that we know we can actually solve is actually the nuclear weapons problem, because within the last generation, there were no nuclear weapons. Now there are, but humans made them, and they can eliminate and abolish them. And yes, there are lots of indicators going in the wrong way in terms of increasing reliance on nuclear weapons by the great powers and some small and middle powers. But there are also contrary indicators that the risk is too high, and the prohibition states that have stepped forward to sign and ratify the Prohibition Treaty on nuclear weapons have established a new political space in which to bring pressure on the nuclear weapons and nuclear allied states. And many of these prohibition and allied states are middle powers. And so the critical political question becomes, is there a coalition of small and middle powers who are prohibitionist and allied, who might bring pressure to bear on the nuclear weapons states to start making some really critical adjustments to reduce tension in general, and specifically to demobilize, dismantle, and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons? In the region that we're discussing, in Asia Pacific, there's one region in particular that is crying out for middle power leadership, and that, of course, is Northeast Asia. And one of the things that middle powers can do there is to convene dialogue and diplomatic discussions, as well as civil society groups and even market players, to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone. In fact, that is probably the legal and political framework within which one would actually directly tackle most effectively the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula. Now, how that effort can be buttressed or supplemented, or in fact based on how middle powers also work the climate issue and the pandemic issue in this region, is less clear, but there must be many opportunities to do that. I know that South Korea has proposed a regional pandemic and/or public health initiative in Northeast Asia. And if that were to be taken up by the nuclear weapon states and great powers in the region, including Japan, that could be a framework with which to actually engage North Korea and actually bring about a denuclearization treaty. So I don't think there's a lack of opportunities here. There's perhaps a lack of political will, but that in turn can change if people understand where those opportunities lie and start to take them. That will generate political momentum in its own right. And where that will end up, no one can predict.
Thank you, Peter. Vivian, can the middle powers do more in filling the leadership void?
You know, I think we'd be in grave trouble on many fronts if it wasn't really for the middle powers on many different issues over many different years. So I think we have to support the increased role of middle powers across a number of things. I think the pandemic has actually been quite interesting in that when people look at what has been happening in the US and the domestic issues within the US, political, social, economic, in a sense has meant a loss of status of the US. So for instance, if you look at ASEAN countries, they really, are finding their own voice more through the pandemic. So you see this happening more. You see Australia and New Zealand historically sitting somewhere between the US and UK, coming its own in the way the pandemic has been managed and distinguish itself differently. So I think we can point to many instances, and we should point to many instances, where the middle powers are distinguishing itself rather than falling into one camp or another. On the other hand, I am, just as people talk about the Asian exceptionalism with COVID, there is such a tendency globally to say, well, there is something about Asia that's different. The Far East means it's far because it's out of sight, out of mind. And knowledge, certainly in the world I live in, still seems to be privileged if it's, generated out of Geneva, London, New York, and Washington. So I think the question is, how do we actually sustain a growing role for the middle powers around different issues? In the World Health Assembly, it was Norway, Brazil, and Thailand that has actually formed a global health alliance and has been really developing younger people, so that Vietnam is picking that up as an example of how to build capacity. So I think we need to actually understand a lot more all the possibilities and really support it.
Thank you very much. And Tuya?
Well, mine maybe will be a perspective coming from someone living in Mongolia, which is sandwiched, as you know, between Russia and China, two major nuclear powers, two major global powers. So my perspective is, I would say, a more realist than idealist outlook, speaking here from Mongolia. I do appreciate the role of middle powers in various spheres of human interaction, but I'm afraid we are back to great power competition. And this has been stated in a number of policy documents in some countries. And so I think this is something that has needs to be taken seriously, evidently. And I'm sure the great powers themselves seem to be sure about competing in this post-Cold War world. Some of the middle powers happen to be allies of some of those great powers, which means that in some circumstances, alliance logic may prevail. So I think that the years to come will be years of big transformation, certainly, but also big conflict with the cyber attacks, possibly. There will be information warfare continuing, and I'm afraid we could see some military confrontation of some sort, be it of regional or other nature. In the world, I'm afraid we'll be watching the great powers act it out. That's my perspective from here.
Thank you. I think that speaks to the point, an issue that we are all cognizant of at the moment about the increasing assertive nationalism that we are seeing in a number of countries. So I wonder is there more that we could do or countries can do to revitalize and improve the commitment to multilateral or regional cooperation to meet these challenges, perhaps in the health space. So Vivian, maybe are there lessons that could be applied to other areas from the positive experience, particularly in Asian countries and in Northeast Asia, to these other big existential challenges?
I think that health has always been a way in which people are able to look for bipartisan solutions. Not always, but quite often. And over recent years, there have been times when the health ministers of China, Korea, and South Korea and Japan have gotten together and maybe looked a little bit awkward politically, depending on the overall tensions in the country. At the same time, they are able to agree not only on issues like infectious disease, but also the population. And what is it that countries can actually learn and how they can cooperate? So we could actually, take the health issue quite broadly and think about the ways you build on that. Now, I am not so familiar with, other sectors, but I would imagine that there are many different issues that really affect the well-being of the community, that really also, at the end of the day, affect the development of the countries economically, socially, and so on. So I think to be looking for different entry points is actually really, really important. It is those people-to-people connections that will be important while the politicians play.
Thank you. Tuya, do you have some thoughts on ways in which we can address the growing nationalism through improving regional or multilateral collaboration or cooperation?
I think this idea of multilateral health initiative determination is something that government and society should work towards. And there is also the issue of climate change, of course. We have climates in this region, which is, if it's cold here in Mongolia, then probably it's cool in Korea or Japan. So we have complementarities and dependencies that can be put to better use. And the engagement of North Korea on health issues is, I think, is one area where we should be given a further thought.
And Peter?
Thanks, Shara. Well, I see two sort of fundamental things happening that give me some reason for optimism in the face of the pandemic catastrophe and the very bleak developments with the climate emergency and the risk of nuclear war. The first is that if you look at what is happening with where humans live over the next generation, we will witness the fastest and greatest growth of cities in human existence, in human history. There will be tens of thousands of new small, medium, large cities, and they will in turn create new kinds of networks and corridors between these cities. And many of these will be led by mayors and corporations and civil society organizations that have transnational cross-border networking and connections and capacities. And while states won't go away, I think the balance is going to shift to a new kind of global governance and leadership based not on 194 or 200 odd nation states, but a vast network of thousands of global decision makers and actors who will collaborate with each other to solve the problems we're talking about out of their own self-interest. And this will be decentralized, it'll be driven by necessity, and it'll be unstoppable. That's the reason that I'm actually quite optimistic. Now, as I said, in this optimistic world, states don't go away. They, in fact, will have to provide crucial information and logistic support. And if we think about the global pandemic at the moment in these terms, we actually have both dynamics underway, but the states are actually the primary source of failure at the moment, not the societal response, as was pointed out by the other panelists. And the fact is that if the United States and China don't cooperate in the next 1 to 5 years to combine their complementary strengths, we will not, as far as I can see, overcome this pandemic. There will be too many reservoirs with too many accelerating mutant varietals of this virus that will come back and infect those who build walls around themselves with weapons of mass destruction and would like to pretend that climate change is actually something still in the future. And this means that the only way forward is for the United States and China to come to terms with each other on the pandemic if they want to survive as great powers. And in turn, if they do so, that will clear away many of the obstacles to solving the other problems, because they will have to put aside those obstacles to solve the COVID problem. And that will make it easier, I think, to deal with climate change. It'll make it necessary to deal with nuclear weapons issues rather than seeing them as necessary and more important. They'll be put back on the back shelf, or even put back into the, well, really into the rear view. We won't be looking at them as primary sources of state power, but rather as these dangerous objects that have to be gotten rid of over the coming decades. So I really do think this region has the ability to be a global fulcrum on which these three problems become solved simultaneously at the local, regional, and global level. And that is a task that really falls to everyone on this call and beyond.
Thank you, Peter. So we're really running up against the clock at the moment. We've seen some common themes during this discussion of improving collaboration, communication, thinking about new kinds of ways of governance, understanding and recognizing that the responsibility for addressing some of these big issues doesn't just lie with governments, but with individuals and with regional organizations, with cities, etc. Before we close the session, I just wanted to give all of you one final opportunity to make any closing remarks or points that you feel that you might not have had a chance to address during the discussion. And I'll turn to Tuya first, then Peter, and then finish with Vivian. Tuya?
At this point in time, I think what's important in terms of resuscitating the global drive towards nuclear weapons abolition, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear disarmament is agree on very concrete steps, firstly, around which dialogue should be restored. And there is also the NPT review conference, which we cannot afford to be a failure. The pursuit of dialogue is needed among nuclear weapon states and nuclear armed states, for that matter, on how to deal with nuclear weapons in the post-COVID world. Because as Peter said, nuclear weapons is one area where humans can make change. So coming together to tackle this risk, at least of nuclear dangers, is one area where global powers, middle powers, and everyone else should be cooperating.
Thank you. Peter?
I'm old enough, Shada, to remember the first UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 and its slogan, "Only One Earth." And I think that still remains a visionary and guiding slogan. There is only one Earth. We're not going anywhere in a hurry. And we know what we have to do. We have to reduce the risk of nuclear war and eventually abolish nuclear weapons so we can focus on the really important issues. And there are lots of starting points, hotlines, all sorts of nuclear risk reduction to get us there that can bring prohibition, umbrella, and nuclear weapon states together. We need to move off fossil fuels, shift to energy efficiency and renewables, which actually turns out to be economically efficient and ecologically good. And we need to do it at really just great speed. This is incredibly urgent from a climate perspective. And then finally, we now know, and we're not going to unlearn this, that we have to pandemic-proof our existence, our infrastructure, our public health systems, and the ways we think and behave. And we have to come to terms with nature, or nature will come to terms with us, and I know who will lose that fight.
Thank you. Vivian?
I want to, in a sense, build on Peter's comment about the importance of cities, and to say that accountability at the end of the day starts at the local level. Cities are at the forefront of managing so many aspects of people's daily lives, whether it's a disaster or whether it's improving well-being. So this connection at the local level is very, very important. The other group of people are actually parliamentarians who also have constituencies, who work across multiple issues, just as city officials have to. So I think that by strengthening this local level understanding and participation and accountability, we can build our way up. And that's what I would encourage people to do.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you for allowing us to end this session on a somewhat hopeful note. Before we close, I just wanted to point people in the direction of the APLN website. Tuya had mentioned earlier a project that the APLN had run last year, which all of you were a part of, with the Research Center for Nuclear Weapons Abolition at Nagasaki University, with the Nautilus Institute and APLN, the Pandemic Nuclear Nexus project, looking at the nexus between these three existential threats and how we can address them. So the information is available on all three websites if people are interested in and looking at the final reports and the presentations which fed into that particular project. So thank you all for your excellent contributions during the session. Thank you to the Jeju Forum for allowing us to run this panel. Thank you to the APLN team for your hard work in putting this event together. And thanks above all to our fantastic panelists, Vivian Lin, Peter Hayes, and Tuya Nayamasor. So thank you so much. And that concludes the session.
Thanks, Shada. Thanks, Vivian. Thanks to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.